All right, we're back. And we're back with a blast. We have Bryan Cantrill from Joyent, creator of DTrace, former Oracle alumni.
What is that about? Why do you even bring Oracle alumni for like 3 of the worst months of my life?
I'm just reading your bio, I'm sorry.
Jesus, that's not in my bio. I know for a fact that's not in my bio.
All right, everyone, give it up for Bryan Cantrill.
All right, hey, Oracle is definitely not in my bio. So hey, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here at the Observability Practitioner Summit. I feel like I'm been dreaming here. This is great to have so many folks that are interested in observability. I've been doing software observability more or less my entire career, which is now getting kind of long at this point. I've been doing this for 20 some odd years. So it's great to see so many people and such enthusiasm for systems observability, something that I believe very strongly in. And just to give us, some kind of the origin of software observability in particular, our software stacks are these incredible, glorious, fetid stacks of abstraction. It's really extraordinary what we can do in software, that we can stand on the shoulders of history, that itself is standing on the shoulders of history, that itself is standing on the shoulders of history so readily. To the point where we don't even necessarily know all of the components in our stack. Yes, we know the components that we are using, but their dependencies and their dependencies and their dependencies. It is very difficult to actually understand that entire stack. And how are we able to do that? How are we able to build things that we are in some ways unaware of? It's because software lends itself so well to abstraction. Software is, and don't let folks from more traditional engineering disciplines trick you into thinking that software is anything like anything else we've ever done before. Software is not a physical thing. Software has this incredible duality that it is both information and machine. It operates like machine, but it's actually information. And as a result, it doesn't wear out. Correct software lasts forever. And I know we like to think of software as being broken all the time, and we're constantly rewriting everything, and there's truth to that for sure. But we also have to remember that software uniquely can have a timeless correctness that allows us to build upon it. And we build these terrifically high stacks of abstraction, whether we want to or not. And the nature of the abstraction prevents us from seeing all the way down. You can't even see all the software that you run, because there is software that you run that is sitting on an ASIC or sitting on a CPU on a motherboard that has got nothing to do with your actual microprocessor. You don't even know that you're relying on it. It's called firmware. And it's probably ruining your life right now. But there is a lot of software. And that software doesn't only run deep, it is silent. Working software doesn't actually emit any noise. There's no light. It doesn't attract mass. I say it mostly has no odor because, let's face it, we've all been in software that is rather odorific, that has a scent to it. But that scent is an artificial scent, right? Actually, software itself is mere representation of information. And if you haven't already had an existential crisis about this, you should. I remember when I first came to work for Sun Microsystems, and I came to work with this guy named Jeff Bonwick, terrific engineer. And I'm in Bonwick's office, and I've been at Sun for like 3 weeks. I'm 22 years old, and I'm very excited doing system software. And we are debugging a problem, and he's got his source code up in an editor. And Bonwick kind of comes away and says, "Does it bother you that none of this exists?" Like, come again? What do you mean? It's like, well, none of this actually exists, right? What we're looking at is an abstraction. We are, ultimately, yes, this will manifest itself in capacitance and DRAM and so on. But this doesn't exist. It's an abstraction. It's entirely artificial. It's like your name. Your name doesn't exist. We made it up. Doesn't that bother you? And I'm thinking, like, what bothers me is I think I've made a major career misstep by coming to someone who is on the cusp of a true midlife crisis. But Jeff is right? It is amazing about software that it is just abstraction. As a result, when it is running, it is unseeable. Your microprocessor executing billions of instructions per second. That's one core of your microprocessor. You've got Uber's microservices, right? You've got that great graph that Uber showed. And oh my God, the perhaps trillions of instructions that are being executed. You can't see all of that at once, which is actually fine, as long as it works. The problem is that it doesn't always work. And all of the advantage of abstraction that we have used to build over time, it cuts against us when that software behaves pathologically. Because now we can't actually see past those layers of abstraction. That airtight abstraction that allowed us to build it quickly now also doesn't allow us to see what is actually going on. And worse, as we go down the stack, work amplifies. When you're at the top of the stack, less does more. That's the definition of being high in the stack of abstraction. If less does more, then a single errant line of code can induce an absolute blizzard of I/O across a data center. Right? I'm sure if you've done observability for your career, you've seen this way more than once, where the problem is that single errant line of code. And worse too, latency amplifies as we come back up the stack. So a latency bubble way at the bottom becomes retried and retried and retried. In that latency bubble, suddenly you've got a P99 at the top of the stack. And as the system becomes dominated by these outliers, the outliers are very important. I think that one thing that we talk about the importance of P95, P99 outliers, those outliers are essential because they are the wisps of smoke of the inferno burning underneath your infrastructure that will burn you to the ground tomorrow. If you understand your P99s, you understand your P95s, you will have much greater understanding of your system. So it's very important that we are able to actually debug these things, and it is hard. The symptoms of a pathological performing system, the symptoms of a system that sucks, is far removed from the actual root cause. I mean, it would be great if we knew exactly which line of code to punish, but it doesn't work that way. Right? The manifestations can be far, far, far away. There's often not one root cause, but several. You can have a problem at the top of the stack inducing symptoms that then induce other problems that feed back into themselves, and now you have a true hurricane, and you cannot find the butterfly that induced it. And it's very important that we realize that when we have that system that is performing terribly, and we're trying to understand why, we are not engaged in a tuning exercise. We are engaged in a debugging exercise. You are at a debugging summit, whether you realize it or not. You may think, God damn it, I'm in the wrong room. You are at a debugging summit. Observability is about debugging. And that is something that I think it's great to see more people get enthusiasm about observability. That's terrific. The bad news is that that enthusiasm needs to come with an understanding that you're going to be using your brain. We're all going to be using our brain to try to actually understand why the system is failing. So we are going to debug. How do we debug? And this is one of these things that is a deceptively subtle question. And even if you ask people who are very, very good at it how they debug a problem, they can't necessarily tell you exactly what they're doing. And I know this because I'm pretty good at debugging problems. And I tried to really sit down and write down what I'm doing. And what I thought I was doing was, I'm engaged in the scientific method, of course. I'm forming a hypothesis, then I'm seeking to disconfirm that hypothesis. Yeah, bullshit. That's a great romantic notion to hold on to. And I know we all as software engineers, we have an inferiority complex that runs very, very deep. And we view ourselves as fundamentally inferior to scientists and engineers. And therefore, we feel we have to have the scientific method just to give ourselves self-worth. But you're not engaged in the scientific method, I hate to break it to you. And indeed, that's the kind of, that is good as is. Scientists aren't engaged in the scientific method either. So it's like the scientific method is not exactly the way that even science is advanced. How do we actually debug problems? We debug problems not by forming hypotheses and seeking to disconfirm them. Although there are people that do that and they drive me crazy. That's I think it's this. And you're like, I think it's this, so I've already changed that tunable. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. You've already changed the production system we haven't gathered any data about the system. And it's like, oh, no, it wasn't that. Oh, no, I think it's this. Okay, wait, stop. Step away from the keyboard. Please, your hypothesis-centric approach is making me homicidal. Please. We don't want to be actually hypothesis-centric. And indeed, in the nastiest problems I've debugged, and there have been many, the hypothesis actually, especially for the nastiest ones, the hypothesis is the thing that you never would have guessed. And it's only when you have actually constrained the problem to oh my God, it must be this. Holy God, I never would have guessed this. How did we constrain the problem? We constrained the problem by making observations of the system. We asked questions, and we got answers. That is the essence of observability. It is debugging. It is asking questions. It is making observations. It is getting answers to those questions. It is using those answers to constrain the possible search space for the pathology, and is asking a new set of questions. And as we ask those questions, the net gets closer, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And if you've done this before or done this many times, you know there's kind of a satisfying feeling when you know there's enough blood in the water, I'm gonna get this thing. I know I'm gonna get this thing. I still have no fucking idea what it is though. I mean, I know it's here, it's right here in my arms, and I know I'm going to get it, but oh my God, this is gonna be a war story for the ages. And that's how you get the war stories for the ages. That's how you get the things that Adrian was talking about in his keynote. So how do we make observations? We ask questions. And sometimes we think of this stuff as being more methodical than it is. How do you ask questions? That's hard. Asking questions is really, really hard. What question do you start with? How do you, and there are lots of methodologies, you know, the use method is a great one. Brendan Gregg's methodology around utilization, saturation, and errors. Those are good starting points for asking questions. But don't fool yourself into thinking that you're just gonna kind of crank through a methodology and out's gonna pop the answer. That's not it. We're gonna have to use our brains to understand the system. We're gonna have to use our tooling to actually understand. They're not recipes for debugging a performance pathology, just as like there's not a recipe for debugging software in the large. So how do we answer these questions? We do it through observation. But again, software can't be seen. We can't actually ask the microprocessor, which instructions are you executing? By the way, 2018, annus horribilis, as it turns out, the microprocessor is executing a whole bunch of other instructions that you didn't know it was executing. So the microprocessor doesn't even know its instructions that it's executing, right? That's specter and meltdown, right? The fact that we've got speculative execution going on that is actually affecting architecture state. Surprise, it's 2018. Not a good year, 2018. So how do we observe software? And that is where it is up to the system to provide the capacity to be seen. A software binary alone executing in a vacuum has no capacity to be seen. It is up to the software around it, the frameworks, the operating systems, and so on, the libraries and so on that are going to run the software, and perhaps up to the software itself, to allow it to be seen. That property, allowing software to be seen, allowing questions to be asked of software, that is observability. If you don't have observability, you're reduced to guessing. And that's a very bad place to be. You do not want to be in the era of guessing. It's not fun. We lived through it. It's bad. We don't want to guess. We want to be able to get answers to our questions. But I would say please do not conflate software observability with control theory observability. And yes, I get it. Control theory observability is the first hit. When I Google observability, I get the Wikipedia page on observability. It's control theory. Oh, this must have its origins in control theory. Please stop. Stop, 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 stop. Control theory observability has got nothing to do with software systems observability. It's a homonym. It's like, oh, I get it. Like, it's a bear. It's coming to kill me. No, it's like, no, it's bear. You're bare naked. Like, you need to put on some clothes. It's a homonym. Okay? It sounds the same. Totally different definition. Observability in control theory is a Boolean property of a system. A system is observable or is not observable. It is the dual of controllability in a control theory. We don't talk about controllability in software. We talk about controllability and that like, oh my God, no one knows how to control the software. But we don't talk about controllability as a theoretical notion in software. We should stop trying to abscond with, or actually, we are using the control theory definition of observability really to reinforce that inferiority complex we have. We want to remind ourselves that we are terrible people who are only but software engineers. We're not actually real scientists or engineers. If only we were control theoreticians, they must know all the answers. Well, by their definition, no software system effectively is observable. So we have got state explosion, right? So we are not in the control theory definition of observability. Our definition of observability is wholly and completely different. If someone would like to edit the Wikipedia page to point to software observability, that would be grand and get us out of there should not be a matrix of states on the definition of observability for software. Control theory, yes. Software, no. Observability is the capacity to ask and answer questions about your system. And so people have been talking about the pillars of observability. And the three pillars of observability, monitoring, logging, and instrumentation. I think that's fine. Those are all fine. I'm in strong favor of all of these things. Monitoring is good, logging is good, dynamic tracing is very good. So these are great. These are important pillars. But it's important to realize that each of these has limitations. And in particular, they all share a very important limitation. They can only answer the questions that you pose of it. It can't figure it out on its own. He's like, oh no, don't worry, I got distributed tracing, everything's fine. It's like, okay, well, it's good that you have distributed tracing, because now you can go ask some sophisticated questions that you were unable to ask before, but don't fool yourself into thinking that the presence alone of distributed tracing somehow will eliminate performance pathologies. It's like, no, don't worry, I've got a microscope, it's sitting right there, we're fine. It's like, well, do you know how to use the microscope? It's like, nope. I've got a CT over here. Do you know how to use that? No, I don't know how to use it. No, we need to know how to use these tools to actually use our brain to actually answer the questions. And I would say that if you want to call these things the pillars of observability, I think that's fine. I think there's probably more than 3 of them, but those are the 3 people talk about. If you want to talk about them as the pillars of observability, great. The human is the foundation of observability. You don't have observability without the observer. And the observer is you, and it's your brain. It's your noodle. So let us not lose track of that. Let us not think that observability is some sort of spray or pill or salve that we take that turns terrible systems into less terrible systems. That's not what it is. All right, enough ranting. Well, no, that's not true. I'm sure I'll rant before, but I'll rant again. But I'm a recidivist in that regard. But enough ranting on that particular subject. So in terms of observability for instrumentation is that very near and dear to my heart and to the hearts of many that are in here. And obviously there are lots of ways to instrument a system. You can instrument a system statically, where you are logging information, you're incrementing metrics and so on. That's great. That's important. Dynamic instrumentation allows the system to be instrumented that doesn't know it's being instrumented, which is an extremely important capacity. One of the things that we certainly learned with DTrace, and I think that we've probably learned with open tracing as well, is the system that has really thought about everything, about how it should be instrumented and so on, yeah, that's the system that's usually not the problem, honestly. The problem is actually the monitoring system that we just threw together at the last minute, or this thing that was done by a group that we since disbanded, or something else, where actually we didn't think about that because we were way further down on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, this is a group that was concerned about physical safety, okay? So like, we're not actually, those pieces of software are the pieces of software that are much more likely to induce pathological performance in systems. So we have to be able to instrument software against its will. It's very important to be able to instrument software against its will, and there are lots of things that do that. You need all these mechanisms. They're very important, but in particular, dynamic instrumentation allows for ad hoc questions. Now, one of the things we're seeing is, which I think is great, is with the amount of logging and monitoring data, but logging especially, data that's being thrown off, we are now asking very ad hoc questions of logging. I mean, I loved using Yuri was talking about Facebook system that's actually doing like feature extraction. I mean, we're using actually machine learning to go process our trace data to be able to ask and answer questions of it. It's pretty cool stuff. So we are able to certainly ask and answer some ad hoc questions, but dynamic instrumentation allows us to actually modify the system to answer those ad hoc questions. And one of the tensions that I see, and we've already seen it, and I thought, again, I loved the Uber talk, where you see the real tension between aggregation and disaggregation of data. Like, we need to aggregate data up, so we can, so we can reduce the actual data volume. That's important. But actually, it's the cognitive volume that we're actually reducing. Now, I think it's actually more important. I mean, you look at again, the Jaeger technology that they talked about, where why are they aggregating like traces together and then trying to show you the outliers? It's not because of the data load. It's because of the cognitive load. It's like, I'm trying to show you, look, human, this one looks different from this one. Or I think it looks different. Why don't you check it out? So aggregation is very important. But when we overly aggregate, we actually lose detail. And so this is an unresolvable tension. There's not like a right or wrong answer. And in fact, you will find that instrumentation systems, observability systems, are constantly going back and forth between aggregation and disaggregation. And I think the best ones allow you to do that fluidly. So I think this is a theme we're going to see, I would dare say, throughout today and in many observability systems. In terms of visualization, again, we saw this with the Uber talk. I know we're going to see this with a bunch of other talks later today. I'm very excited to see this. I am very pro-visualization, right? I really like the visual cortex, as it turns out. Visual cortex is very nice. The visual cortex allows you to instantly see things that are very hard to see otherwise. Thank God for millions of years of food and mates or whatever else we needed to evolve the visual cortex, but we have the ability to actually spot patterns that are very hard to spot any other way. And I think with visualization, one of the things I like about visualization is there's not one way to visualize the system. Indeed, just to go back to the origins of software, software is at its root unobservable. So any visualization is effectively an abstraction, and there are lots of different kinds of abstractions. So don't think that there's like one way to visualize a system. There are many different ways to visualize a system, and it is an area that is ripe for innovation. There are lots of new ways, different ways to do it. So it's great to see, again, so much work in different aspects of visualizing the system. I really loved the diffs of the traces that the Uber guys were showing, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more over the day. Just to give a shout out to the old school of visualization, because I think sometimes in observability we are getting a little too frameworky to a degree. I am definitely like pro frameworks. Frameworks can offload a lot of work for you, but you don't want to be so pro framework that you've lost the ability to actually reason about things from first principles. And in particular, you should be able to visualize data. As someone who believes in observability, as a software engineer, you should be able to visualize data absent effectively any large framework or system that does it for you, because there are tools that you can pull off the shelf that actually will do it, like GNU Plot. I love GNU Plot. The GNU Plot, I feel when I look back over my entire career, it is GNU Plot that has stayed with me the longest. GNU Plot has seen me through my worst time. So if you haven't used GNU Plot, I love GNU Plot. If you do use GNU Plot, or if you haven't used GNU Plot and you start using GNU Plot because of what I'm saying, when you go to use GNU Plot, you're like, I must be using the wrong tool because that guy really loved GNU Plot, and this thing seems to be like R on methamphetamine. I mean, this is like, what is this thing even? So I've got a complicated relationship with GNU Plot. But GNU Plot allows you to easily visualize data, easily graph data. Obviously, there are lots of other ways to do it. But I've debugged many, many, many problems using GNU Plot. Now, obviously, GNU Plot is what's visualizing data that I'm gathering elsewhere. Heat maps, so this is something that we pioneered at Sun. Brendan and Greg pioneered way back in the day. Richard McDougall with Adrian, remember their Taz tool way back in the day. And so Taz tool was something they had developed. I think Richard had developed that while still in Australia, right? And right. We had a tradition in Australia, in Sun, of abducting Australians, including Richard, including Brendan, and that had been a really interesting way to visualize the system. We then codified that into a storage appliance we built. This is in 2008, and heat maps are now very widespread, which is great, as they should be. It's a very useful way to visualize latency. It's allow you to easily see outliers and so on. Flame graphs is something that Brendan Gregg developed actually while he worked at Joyent. Flame graphs are a way of, how many people know about flame graphs? That's great. That's terrific. Okay, so flame graphs are great. Flame graphs allow you to aggregate like stack traces together such that you can begin to see the mass. So flame graphs in this kind of this trend of aggregation, flame graphs are born around doing CPU profiling, and they're very useful in that regard. The thing that I actually love about flame graphs is something I kind of took note of is the fact that the visualization tool was entirely orthogonal from the way of instrumenting the system. That you could, however you instrumented the system, you could then feed it into a flame graph. I mean, it was much more like GNU Plot in that regard, and much less like this kind of built-in system for heat maps, where it's like, well, you had to kind of be running this whole thing to get this heat map. You didn't have to be running any whole thing to get a flame graph. You just had to have data that was amenable to this kind of visualization, and then you could just pull it off and visualize it that way. So that was very, I think, inspiring and interesting and eye-opening. And then one of the nice things about these visualization techniques is that they can be system neutral, which is great, and methodology neutral. So this is a very long introduction to Statemaps, and let me describe a little bit the problem that we have had, the terrible problems that we have had. So one thing that is extremely frustrating is a system that is terrible. It doesn't seem to be doing anything. So the system is awful. You know the system is awful. You're like, system, what are you doing? And it's like, I am idle. It's like, why are you idle? What are you supposed to be doing right now? And you want to get the system to the point where it is maximizing all of its resources, or at least maximizing the resource that you know to be the bottleneck in the system. But it is often in these pathological systems, you see that they're idle, or, as more likely the case, it's like they're idle, they're doing work, they're just not doing work all the time. And when they're not doing work, you've got no idea why they're not doing work. And it's extremely frustrating to understand why this is. And in part because it's very hard to separate out the symptoms. Because you're not doing work, well, I'm going to stop. I'm waiting for you, and someone else is waiting for me. Now, the reason I'm not doing work is that thing over there is not doing work. It's like, well, why is he not doing work? Well, I'm not doing work because this thing's not doing work. And you're trying to understand this all dynamically. It can be very, very hard to understand why the system isn't doing work. When the system, let us all have CPU performance problems. May you be blessed with a lifetime of CPU performance problems where it's like this thing is in a spin loop. God bless it, it's in a spin loop. Because something that is on CPU is like, hey, look at me, I'm over here. I'm doing work. I'm doing the dumb thing right over here. Come look at me anytime. OK, you got to go to lunch. No worries, I'm going to be back. I'll come back from lunch. I'm still here. That's easy. That's great. Easy, not easy. It's easier because you can ask the question, what are you doing, software? You can explain to me what you're doing. But when nobody is doing work, it's like you're like walking into the DMV. It's like, okay, like you go into the DMV, I'm like, I see that there are like 800 people waiting, and there are like 9 people that are like not doing it. Like, what is going on? Where is the bottleneck in the DMV? Like, just sit down. You're like, all right. A little bit frustrating, and unfortunately, many more of our systems are like the DMV. So state maps are a way of visualizing the system over time. So this is a state map here, and what I've done is every row here is a particular entity in the system, and I'm actually going to hop out here, and we're actually going to look at this thing live because it's a little more interesting. So this is the state map, and we can actually, I can actually kind of select a time range here and zoom in and zoom out, and what this is showing me is, so this entity, for example, is an auto vacuum worker, and it is showing me what its behavior is over time. And so we've got time on the x-axis, we've got entities stacked on the y-axis, and we can immediately see some patterns here. Right? We can immediately see some striations here that are interesting, where a whole bunch of Postgres processes are encountering some of the same things at the same time. And we may want to zoom in to understand, okay, what are we doing here? We're blocked. In this case, the state that we are in is we are in ZFS read. Okay, well, how did the system know this? How did this actually work? And for that, let's hop back here. So we actually, and I need to get the hotkeys on that to get in there and out of there quickly. So what we're actually doing is taking a payload of concatenated JSON where every line is a datum of a particular time in nanoseconds, an entity, and the state that it entered. So we're not keeping track of the state that it was in. The state map will do that. We're just keeping track of the new state that it's in. And then what we have done, and then these states are actually enumerated in a kind of a metadata payload at the beginning. And then what we actually do is we've got little ways of instrumenting the system in different regards to generate this output. But you could use that in any system to generate that output, because the state maps are entirely neutral with respect to methodology. And then it generates, yes, I know I say asvig, I know I pronounce it svig, everyone else pronounces it svg. It's me, I'm wrong, I can't correct myself, I'm sorry. Keep saying it svg, or people will make fun of you the way they mock me, and God forbid you be in my category here. It's awful, but it's a svig to me, so just stay back. In terms of the way we instrument it, we've got a bunch of different ways of doing it for the database, CPU, I/O, and so on. And some of these have got really low rates, like less than 10 states per second. Some of them have many, many state transitions, like over 1 million per second. In fact, we have so many states that we actually need to go coalesce those states in order to actually allow us to visualize it reasonably. So if we look at this, for example, if I zoom in, I can see that I've kind of like lost a lot of fidelity here, right? And so let's actually look at one of these things where I've zoomed in and I've lost a lot of fidelity. Well, we actually have the entire trace that is the entire disaggregated trace. So we can now tell the state map rendering code, hey, I'm interested in this particular time bounds, so give me some better resolution. And now this is what we see. So this is actually the same period of time, even though, and I'll zoom out so you can see it a little bit better. That's the same period of time as that. And you can see there's a lot more going on. And actually, if we zoom in on one of these things, so this is, all this yellow is blocked on a ZFS read. We are blocked on a read because, yes, this is a spindle. I know, I'm sorry. I would love to get rid of all the spindles, please, but I'm still having to deal with spindles. We can see that this whole thing is, 216 milliseconds long. There's a story there. The I/O should not take that long, but this I/O is taking that long. And you see these little green bits right here? That's CPU. Doink, doink, that's CPU. You are on CPU for what? You are on CPU. We're going to be off CPU on a read for 200 and what odd milliseconds. We're on CPU actually for 2 milliseconds, and that's actually a long time to be on CPU, honestly. Actually, if we zoom in even more, this is every state transition there, and we can actually see how long we are actually on CPU. And you can see that before we do I/O, this is a Postgres doing I/O, you are on CPU for not that long. This is now 4 milliseconds across the top, and you can see we spend that all of our time is just dominated by the I/O. Right, it can be pretty eye-opening in this regard. And this up here, we've got, I believe that is the checkpointer process. So this has been pretty eye-opening for us. And one of the things that we thought, looking at CPUs, this is 10 seconds of CPU activity. And the idleness on this CPU is in gray. So you can see when you think of like my CPU is 65% utilized. It's like, well, if that's the way you want to think about it, that's fine. That's great. That's actually not what's happening, though. Your CPU is either utilized or not utilized over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And you can see that there's a whole zoo of behavior and activity here. You can see there's a lot of interesting things you can see here. You can see the CPUs that are fielding interrupts. Those are the ones in blue. You can see that there's some clear striations here. Like there's one there, and there is one there. That's about 800. There's another one a couple seconds later. So we can see that there's some clear striations there, which is interesting, that seem to be on second boundaries. There's a lot of CPU work here. And one thing we might want to know is like, well, what was going on here? Which is definitely a question we had. So one thing we did is we allowed for states to be tagged. And you can say, hey, when I'm going on CPU, here's some additional context tagging about what's going on. And you can actually then drill down dynamically about what's actually going on. So we may actually want to know what is going on during this period of time. And I've got a lot of node going on. Like, OK. And before you make I know it's tempting to make a pejorative remark about Node, but we are throwing a lot of work at Node. Node's actually doing fine here. Node is not the problem. We can see there's some Postgres here, there's some stud. That bar is all Telegraph, so Telegraph waking up, the monitoring service becoming the problem, and so on. So anyway, this is interesting. To actually zoom in, this is just 500 milliseconds now. So if you look at 500 milliseconds, there's all sorts of interesting behavior within 500 milliseconds. I mean, in particular, I'm kind of mesmerized by that kind of dashed line there, like where every other core is suddenly doing kernel work. Recranking that, we can kind of zoom in on that. So now we have every state transition, or just about every state transition, this is 10 milliseconds in the life of your CPU. There's a whole lot going on. This is not running one thing. This is running many things, and when it's running something, it's not even necessarily running it for very long. So there is a lot that's going on. In terms of how we've actually used this, one of the things we found valuable is to actually be able to stack state maps on top of one another. So this is a view that has a ZFS-related state map around zpool syncing, an I/O-related state map around I/O activity, and a Postgres state map. And what this actually shows us is, this was getting to the actual root of the problem we actually had, which is why is Postgres so terrible during an auto vacuum? And one of the things that we would see is these giant towers of blocking. So Postgres will be blocked, and we could not find out why. The visualization actually gives us a big hint. See this thing? The green guy there, and we'll actually zoom in on it. So all that red is blocked on a semaphore operation. The green is blocked on the transaction delay in ZFS, which it's a reasonable inference that, like, well, is this thing actually holding the lock that all these other things are depending on? And indeed, when we investigated this, it was. And you can see that it corresponds to periods of time of it is induced by periods of time of no I/O, for other more complicated reasons, but it goes on during periods of high I/O. As it turns out, this is yet another pathological behavior in Postgres around the way the wall files are managed. This thing is trying to initialize a new wall file, which Postgres, because it is running on, I don't know, a machine from 1983, decides that it needs to write zeros through the entire wall file, the new wall file. It does that with the entire database locked. So it is doing writes, and it does small writes to just add insult to injury. It does all these little small writes to B0 a wall file. It's like, you don't need to B0 the wall. OK. And while it's doing this, ZFS is already write corked So ZFS is like, I've got too many writes, so each one of these writes I'm going to throttle. And it's throttling each write for about a millisecond, which doesn't sound like too big a deal until you do 7,000 writes, writing zeros to a new wall file, and then you actually have this, which is, yes, a 7-second delay in transaction time. It only happens when you actually need to go recycle the wall segment. Doesn't actually happen that frequently. But when it happens, it causes these huge rash of P99 outliers that cause the entire system behind it to throw up on itself. And this is what I mean by these problems are, we are deep, deep, deep into one system. This is not even a distributed system. This is one system, and it has induced this cascading failure up the stack. Also, please, if someone could get Spindle's firmware and Postgres out of my life as quickly as possible, I'd really appreciate it, as an aside. Just to wrap up quickly with a couple of other examples where we've done this. This is a Cassandra benchmark that we were running, or a Cassandra system that we were running that would do sporadically no work. And as you can see, this is I/O work. It should be doing I/O work all the time. And it is actually entering these little divots of actual no work. And the divots actually don't go on that long, OK? That is, what, 606, you can't read it from there, but that's 675 milliseconds. This is just 675 milliseconds of doing no work across this entire cluster. So clearly, there's something going on. This is Nagel, by the way. This Cassandra is being nagled because they erroneously did not set TCP no delay on their socket. So Cassandra is constantly stuttering over and over and over again because it wants to wait for more data to accumulate before it actually sends something onto the wire. So it'll do work and then stop, and then do work and then stop, and do work and then stop. And I would love to tell you that we found that one quickly. But we didn't. That was very painful to find. Finally, and just to wrap up, this is a view across many more hosts of, this is VDEV activity. This looks like a quilt, I know. I'm not sure if this visualization is useful. This is but giving you a taste of what state map visualization looks like across many, many more machines. I'm not sure how useful this is right now, honestly. It was definitely very useful in this case to be able to confirm what we already knew, or we had a hunch of, which is that this thing is going through these little microbursts of idleness that is actually synchronized across the entire cluster. I don't know how useful it is in this case, but it's still an area of active exploration. All right, so just to hop back to my last concluding slide before Ted actually lunges at me and throws me off the stage. I'll put these slides online so you can you'll be able to get to the rest of these. The key about state maps is using visualization to prompt questions. That is what we were trying to do. This is not a tool that's going to give you answers generally. It is going to give you questions to ask. And that checkpointer problem that I described, that wall segment problem, I don't know how we would have debugged that without this. In fact, I know we didn't debug it without it. We tried to debug it without this, but we had to invent the tool in part to debug the problem. So it can be hard to prompt the right questions. State maps use visualization to prompt those questions, but it works in concert with your other observability facilities. And I think this is a theme you're going to see throughout the day. There's not one system, one thing to take away. It's how we use these things together to actually understand these systems. We've got to keep the human in mind when we're designing for observability, because the capacity to answer questions is only good as the human's ability to ask them. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan Cantrill.